I want to tell you something I used to be embarrassed about. I cry at movies. Not every movie, but when a scene lands right, when a character loses something they can't get back, my throat tightens before I've actually decided to feel anything. My eyes burn. Tears come before my brain has finished processing what just happened. For a long time, I thought this was a flaw, an overreaction. Fiction isn't real. The people on screen don't actually exist. The grief isn't actually mine. Then I read about what archaeologists found in a cave in Iraq, and I stopped being embarrassed. Because what happens when you cry at movies isn't a glitch. It's actually one of the most important things about being human. Older than language, older than art, older than anything we normally point to when we talk about what makes us who we are. There's a version of this we've all been taught. Crying at fiction is soft, emotional, a sign that you're too easily affected by things that don't matter. The rational argument: if you know it's not real, your body shouldn't respond as if it is. The character isn't dying. No one is actually suffering. Your tears are being triggered by something invented, and yet the body doesn't care. Your throat tightens before permission is given. Your chest pulls tight. Your eyes respond. This happens to people who consider themselves emotionally controlled. It happens to people who know film theory and can name every technique being used to manipulate them. It still works. The question is why? Why would the human body develop a response to suffering that isn't real? Why would evolution preserve a mechanism that wastes emotional resources on situations that pose no actual threat? The answer isn't that emotion escaped the logic of natural selection. The answer is that this response was so critical to survival that the brain never built a way to turn it off. Because for most of human history, there was no fiction. There was only other people. And feeling what they felt wasn't optional. For 300,000 years, the people around you were your entire world. Their pain was data. Their fear was a warning signal. Their grief was information about what the group had lost, and what that meant for your survival. The person who could feel that information, not just observe it, made better decisions, stayed, helped, warned, sacrificed at the right moment. The fiction came later. The capacity came first. In 1957, a paleoanthropologist named Ralph Selecki began excavating a cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq. The cave was called Shanidar. What he found there changed how we understand what it means to be human. One of the skeletons was a Neanderthal man. He had a withered right arm, useless, probably from birth. One eye socket was crushed. His legs showed severe arthritis. Every movement he made would have been painful. He was completely dependent on others for food, for protection, for survival. He lived to approximately 40 years old. In a world where the average person died before 25, someone kept him alive. For years, not occasionally, consistently. Through seasons, through migrations, through everything a hunter-gatherer group endured. To do that, someone had to feel what he felt. Not just observe his pain, feel it. Project into his experience and respond to it as their own. You're watching a scene. The character on screen loses someone. Your throat tightens. Your eyes burn slightly at the corners. You didn't decide this. The response arrived before you gave it permission. That sensation, that specific involuntary pull, is the same mechanism that kept a disabled Neanderthal alive for 15 years in a cave in northern Iraq. That's not weakness. That's the oldest form of intelligence your species has. You'd think that once your brain catches up and reminds you the character isn't real, the response would stop. It doesn't. And that's exactly the point. The mechanism was never designed to check whether the suffering was real. It was designed to respond first. Every time. 92% of people report physically crying at fiction at least once in their lives. Not feeling sad. Physically crying, tears, tight throat, the whole response, for characters who don't exist. That number comes from research on emotional responses to narrative. It's not a niche behavior, it's the baseline. In 1992, a neuroscientist named Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma was studying the motor cortex of macaque monkeys. His team found something they weren't looking for. Neurons that fired not just when the monkey performed an action, but when the monkey watched another perform the same action. The neuron couldn't tell the difference. These became known as mirror neurons. The direct evidence in humans is more complex, but the behavioral pattern is unmistakable. Your brain runs a continuous simulation of the people around you. When someone flinches, something in your motor cortex activates. When someone's face shows pain, your brain's pain regions become more active. You are not just observing other people. You are partially running them. Think about the last time someone described a physical injury to you in detail. A broken bone, a burn. Your face changed before you decided it should. Something tightened. You may have looked away. That wasn't politeness. That was your brain doing exactly what it was built to do. The groups that could do this were harder to destroy. They felt what their members felt. They responded to pain they weren't experiencing. They kept the disabled man alive because his suffering registered as their own. They coordinated better, sacrificed more for each other, built things that required trusting people they couldn't constantly watch. The groups that couldn't do this were more fragile. One bad season, one betrayal, one person left behind who shouldn't have been. The groups that built civilization had this capacity in full. It's why you feel the weight of wars that ended decades before you were born. The mechanism doesn't check dates. It doesn't verify whether suffering is current or invented. It responds to one signal. Someone is suffering. What does that mean for the group? What does it require of you? That question is 300,000 years old. Your body is still answering it. Think about what that throat tightening actually is. You're sitting in the dark, or on a couch, or in a car, listening to a song that suddenly does something to you. The specific sensation, not sadness exactly, something tighter, starting behind the sternum and moving upward. Your body has been doing this for 300,000 years. Every person who ever sat with someone who was dying and felt the pull of their grief. Every parent who felt their child's pain before the child understood what pain was. Every person who stayed when leaving would have been easier, because something in them couldn't locate the boundary between their suffering and someone else's. The sensation you feel in a movie is a faint echo of what that felt like at full volume, when the suffering was real, when the person was right in front of you, when your response to their pain was the difference between them surviving or not. Most of human history was spent in groups of 50 to 150 people. You knew every face, every voice. You had watched these people be born, get hurt, grieve, recover. Their suffering was not abstract. It arrived as a physical signal in your body before your mind had processed it. The movie version is quieter, but it uses the exact same channel. That thread runs directly through you, to this moment, to the character on the screen who is losing something. Your body cried for a stranger who never existed, and it was right to. You didn't develop this response by accident. Every human who came before you, every person whose line survived long enough to reach you, carried this capacity. The ones who felt nothing for others made decisions that isolated them. The ones who felt too much to be functional couldn't coordinate. The ones who felt enough to act, enough to stay, enough to sacrifice when it mattered. Those are the ones whose children had children. You are the direct result of 300,000 years of natural selection for empathy. The discomfort you feel when a movie ends and you're still carrying the grief of a fictional character. That's not a design flaw. That's not oversensitivity. That's the mechanism working exactly as it should. You didn't learn to cry at movies. You were born already knowing how to. Because the people who came before you needed that capacity to be automatic. Not learned, not chosen, just there, every time, without asking permission. They needed it to survive. You inherited it. And so did everyone watching that same scene in the dark, throat tightening, not quite knowing why.